Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. So first I want to welcome everyone here for Expanding Land Conservation Approaches for the Chicago Wilderness Region. We're really excited to present this work after about almost 2 years of work from both the foundation and then more recently from the team listed on this page. Some housekeeping before we get started. All the attendees are in silent mode, so you won't be able to speak, but if you do have a question within the control panel, either on the bottom or the side of your screen, depending on how it is, you'll see a box that says Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to type questions as well as see the other questions that others have asked throughout the webinar. And you're also able to upvote those questions. So rather than typing the question again, if you see something that you're also interested, please just hit that upvote button so that we can collect those at the proper point. We'll be stopping twice throughout the webinar to answer questions. One towards the beginning, and then we'll have a lengthier chunk at the end. And then there will be a recording of the webinar. So if you have colleagues or coworkers who aren't able to make it, please be sure to tell them that there's a recording available, and that's going to also be available on the Donnelly website as well. So with that, I'm going to pass the camera over to David Farron from the Donnelly Foundation to kind of introduce the presentation.
Great, thank you, Ben, and good afternoon, everyone. Want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us this afternoon. It's great to see this level of interest in exploring conservation strategies in the Chicago region. Also want to thank Ben and Peter Stein, who's also on the line and will be co-presenting. Our consulting team of Lyme, Delta, and the Open Space Institute have been hard at work on this for over a year. We also appreciate all the grantees and other funders who they engaged with during the process. The team will explain the methodology shortly, but again, the report was a year in the making with a phase 1 and phase 2, as will be shared. Lots of discussion, research, drafting, and back and forth. So pleased that we're finally at this point to share it with you after review by our board of directors. So just to share a little bit about the team and the process from the foundation's perspective, we did an RFP. It was distributed nationally, and we sort of feel like we got the best of both worlds with Lyme Timber, who works all over and has done lots of projects like this all over the country. It's a firm that we've worked with in our mission investing as well, so they bring that expertise. And then having both Delta here and OSI in the Low Country just brings that knowledge and experience with our two regions. So excited that this team is working with us, and glad we're at this point. So I'll just step back for a minute to answer the question, why did our board charge us to take this on? We've been supporting conservation work for a long time. But looking here at the Chicago Wilderness Conservation Vision Map, it's a very bold, audacious vision for the region. It's been a process to think about where the opportunity is, and thinking about the level of resources and the level of challenges. So we really wanted to dig deeper and think about approaches that could get get traction and provide leverage, knowing that the resources of our foundation and the other funders in the conservation space, those resources are limited. So, where are there leverage opportunity? And the report particularly looks at opportunities where there's a funding potential component as well. So again, from the foundation perspective, and we can flip to the next slide, we work in two very different regions, and we really wanted to drill down on some of the differences in terms of not only the landscape, but also the opportunities. Of course, the Chicago region we all know and love as a very sprawling, fragmented urban region, largely surrounded by industrial scale agriculture. And so, what particularly relative to those defining features of the region could be used as engines for increasing conservation. We have different land use in our two regions, different social and political climates, and we really wanted to dig deeper to take a look at emerging strategies that might be more tailored to each of our two regions. And we also wanted to look at this through a broad lens. So, this is the buzzword these days, ecosystem services. Also thinking about climate resilience, the evolving policy landscape, and again, potential revenue streams, and looking at engaging diverse communities. So we know that many of these approaches are already underway, that many of you are already working on some of these things, but we really wanted to capture that energy and really highlight where our consulting team felt that there may be an opportunity to get further traction. The report also reflects looking at a variety of levels of protection, durations of protection, types of restoration, thinking about ecological uplift. We'll continue to support permanent land conservation, restoration of natural systems, but that's very, very important to the mission of the foundation. But these are things that we see as potentially additives to the strategy toolbox. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Peter and Ben.
Great. Well, this is Peter Stein. You don't see a video of me, but I'm really here joining all of you. And I was very lucky to be part of this team. So when the RFP came out, Lyme reached out to the Open Space Institute and Delta Institute to kind of build a group that had deep domain expertise, particularly around the financing mechanisms that can increase the pace and scale of land and natural resource conservation, and with an eye to having actual practitioners be part of the team. While we're consultants in the context of this assignment, each of these groups, Lyme, Delta, and Open Space Institute, have actual direct project and transactional experience with many of the mechanisms and policies that we have shared with the foundation. To begin the process, which we call phase one, we did a series of interviews around the country with leading land conservation practitioners. They may be working for state natural resource agencies. They may be working for national or regional land conservation NGOs and land trusts, a few federal folks, and some folks from the private and philanthropic investment world. We also did a literature review to see beyond our interviews, were there any other things happening that we thought might have the chance of having traction in these two somewhat different geographies that the Donnelly Foundation focuses in. The interviews and the literature review came together into a framework where we identified and did a bit of an analysis of slightly more than 60 ideas or mechanisms that might have limited or broad applicability to the geographies that the Donnelly Foundation is focused on. This initial assessment was shared with the staff of the foundation. We actually spent a whole day going through it to identify kind of the top set of strategies or mechanisms that deserved further research and could be shared with a significant number of the existing grantees of the foundation to get their feedback, to get a sense of whether they are already experimenting or delivering land conservation or natural resource conservation using some of these techniques. So let's go into phase 2. And that's where we, with the help of the staff of the foundation, came up with sort of an assessment lens that allowed us to highlight or focus on a set of the policies and mechanisms that we thought would have the highest degree of not just traction, but near-term applicability in the greater Chicago area and the coastal South Carolina region. These were then identified. We did local expert interviews to talk through the reality of the political setting, funding partners, ability to convey these ideas to public agencies that may be part of the land conservation schemes in these geographies. And that allowed us to create the phase 2 report. And let's go to phase 3. So we are just in the first couple of months of phase 3. This was initiated in early April with a delivery of our findings to the board of directors of the Donnelly Foundation at their board retreat in Columbia, South Carolina. We got a very positive response. Working closely with David and Carrie, we decided that there were 2 initial mechanisms, this being one, this webinar, and the annual meeting of grantees that takes place next week in Charleston, South Carolina for the Low Country folks. So this webinar is focused on the specific, sharing the specific sort of top tier mechanisms and policies for which we believe will have traction in the greater Chicago area. And then next week's gathering will focus on those same top tier strategies, albeit different ones, that have the greatest chance of being implemented in coastal South Carolina. We have continued to think through sort of implementation paths for these top tier strategies. And that's really a conversation that our consulting team is having with the staff of the foundation. And we assume that, those conversations will continue with the grantee world as well. So let's dig in a little bit. So
before we jump into the next phase, we wanted to just give an opportunity, if you have any questions, now would be a good time around the foundation and why they set out to do this work, as well as some of our additional methodology. Peter, I see a question for you from Greg Rajski, which is asking to know more about the financing mechanism, what you mean by financing mechanisms to increase scale.
So this would be what public financing mechanisms, philanthropic financing mechanisms, and private market financing mechanisms can either by themselves or through blended finance come together to increase the scale of land conservation. I'll use an example very quickly that relates more to South Carolina than Chicago, but large timberland investment management organizations own land in the watersheds that provide freshwater resources for the rivers that end up in the Atlantic Ocean. And those forests are under possible threat from over-harvesting or land conversion to other uses. But it's really private capital mixed with public dollars in the form of conservation easement purchase dollars that could grow the scale of conservation within those watersheds. In a Chicago context, it might be public and private dollars that come together to accelerate the pace of green infrastructure investments. If you just relied on private or if you just relied on public, the scale would be diminished.
Great. And then there's another question from Jim Anderson asking around, do you have a copy of the phase 1 work and who are the interviewees? We can provide a list of the interviewees from phase 1. There's a list from the local practitioners within the phase 2 report. And then from phase 1, the part that we've made public is a funding and financing chart, which has about 60+ strategies, and we'll get into that in a minute. But if there are no other questions, I will pass it back to Peter to get into the meat of the conversation.
So David can probably give a better answer, but I think one of the reasons that our team was selected is fairly deep domain expertise in both sort of conventional and sort of brave and new and innovative funding mechanisms, whether, again, public funding, philanthropic funding, and private market investment and financing. So we organized the funding and financing mechanisms in this chart. The darkest green are the ones that we really focused on, but just so you know, we did look through, an example would be the applicability of New Markets tax credit financing in some of the geographies if they met the economic distress criteria. In certain parts of the United States, land conservation has been dramatically accelerated, and I would use Virginia and Colorado as examples, where fungible or resellable state income tax credits. We dug a little bit into opportunity zones, although we don't see a lot of benefit at the moment for that new tax incentive. And we certainly looked at preferential assessment programs. We then took that large set of phase 1 identified policies and used these 4 sort of criteria to rank them to determine which ones bubbled to the top and really had applicability within the 2 specific regions that the Donnelly Foundation was interested in. And when we did the analysis using these 4, so funding availability, the potential impact or scalability, and the fact that there were enabling conditions, both politically and in the competency of the NGOs that were working in these geographies, that gave us a sense of which of the mechanisms would be both applicable and be able to be implemented in the 2 geographies. So in the case of Chicago, well, you can't read this. There's actually real written words here. That's not gibberish. It's just at a scale that makes it unreadable in this webinar. But it is something that the foundation is sharing with you in the publication that describes phase 2. So let's go to the initial strategies. In Chicago, the greater Chicago region, we looked at a fair number of strategies. All of these had some degree of traction or the ability to be implemented, but some had greater than others. And an example would be collaborating with water management utilities because of a variety of issues. There is a chance, whether it's water quality or water quantity management, Local governments are tasked with obligations under the Clean Water Act to deal with both of those issues, and there is a great way for conserved land to play a role, or restored and conserved land to play a role in reducing some of the expenses of local government and expanding sort of the green infrastructure model at the same time. Another example in the greater Chicago area that we'll go into a lot more detail soon is the fact that there is a significant amount, in fact, approximately a quarter of the land already protected in the greater Chicago wilderness area would be the equivalent of the acres that are available for restoration and protection within just electrical transmission right-of-ways. And how, because it's a highly fragmented landscape and these are linear connected resources, how can they be better utilized for both habitat quality and connectivity? And that's something that we actually dug pretty deep on, and Ben will share that with you in a couple of minutes. So these are examples of the strategies. We're about to go into the top tier strategies in the Chicago Wilderness region, and Ben will sort of set the stage for sort of the operating conditions that we found in the region and why we came up with these top tier strategies.
Great, thanks, Peter. So as you kind of heard, once we finished that phase 1 work, we really delved deep on both of those tier 1 and tier 2 strategies. We did a number of interviews with a number of you who are on this webinar and others who talking about in your work, what is appealing to you, what is exciting you, where do you see opportunities, and how can the foundation and others play a role in supporting those efforts. So I always like this map, which is the land cover map of the Chicago Wilderness region, which really just shows kind of that urban developed core, but also the number of cultivated acres in the surrounding geography outside of kind of that near Lake Michigan region. So it's important to remember the diversity of geographies we have in this region, in the way in which different funding and financing opportunities might play a role in each of those. So when we finalized our work, these 4 strategies kind of came to the top as we continued to do research. The first one will be linking watershed protection and stormwater management. The second one was leveraging federal ag programs for conservation and increasing that where possible. Next is utilizing utility corridors and the opportunities for connections that exist there. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the carbon finance opportunities that might exist. So delving in to the first strategy, which we framed as leveraging farm bill programs. I mean, there's a lot of agricultural conservation work that can be done, but we really saw an opportunity in our geography to increase the access and use of farm bill programs. And one of the reasons is remember when this work was done, we were still in the midst of the most recent farm bill negotiation. So a lot of this work is in reference to the old farm bill, but we're excited about, some of the changes that have maybe streamlined, increased incentives, while actually not restricting or losing funding for that conservation title. So that's pretty exciting, and it creates an exciting time and an exciting opportunity for partners to look at how to, leverage those programs for conservation value. So this map shows you that cultivated map, but zooming in on the agricultural land in our region. So 49% of the Chicago wilderness geography is in cultivated acres. Obviously, that's primarily outside of the Chicagoland geography, but it's a critical mass. It's about 3, and then it's also important to remember with this, we're losing about, within the whole country, about 3.6 million acres, or sorry, in Illinois alone, we're losing about 3.6 million acres since 1950. So there's a loss of agricultural land as well, and that loss is primarily to development. So thinking about, how the loss of agricultural land actually has a negative impact as well on conservation values even further is something to consider. So this map, and it's a little hard to see the blue at points, but it shows you the blue is the protected land in the region. And then that green is once again the cultivated acres. And what we ran a query on this, and what we found was that 82% of the protected natural lands in our region are buffered or even within agricultural acres, either fully surrounded or touching at one point. And what that tells us is, not only are agricultural acres critical because of the scale of them, but they're also critical because of the impact they have on our already protected natural areas. And if we want the best ecosystem health within those protected natural areas, we're going to have to consider what surrounds them and how those are having an impact on them. So we see this as a great opportunity. When you look at Farm Bill programs, so we pulled 2017 numbers. This just tells you the scale of the millions of dollars going into Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin currently. So that was what was committed from NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service programs in 2017. So some of those are from long-term contracts, some of them are new payments. It's a combination, but this is a sizable chunk of money every year going to our region, which is, a very ag-heavy geography. So moving on, I think it's important to talk about when the Farm Bill programs, the conservation title started, there were about 13 plus programs on a variety of different topics. Those have now been scaled down. And what we lay out here is kind of the ones that we put in front of the foundation, showed them as we see the most value for the work that they're doing in terms of landscape scale conservation. A lot of the programs have been consolidated. So these are the most active existing programs in this region. And they do, and this gets at what David was saying at the beginning, they show a variety of different scales in terms of the length of time. So moving from the bottom up, you have the Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which are both they help you set up a conservation stewardship plan and then give you payments on an annual basis for practices that you put in. The Regional Conservation Partnership Program, I'll save for right at the end to talk about. A little bit longer is the Conservation Reserve Program, which allows farmers or other agricultural landowners to take acreage out of production and receive a payment for that on 10 to 15-year contracts. So a little bit longer. They're often re-enrolled after the end of that process, but there's not a permanence there. And then there's the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, which provides for both permanent easements for agricultural land and for wetlands, as well as shorter-term easements, 30-year term easements for the Wetland Reserve Program. So that is what's really interesting about those programs too, is not only will they pay, so the Agricultural Land Easement Program, for example, will pay 50% of the fair market value for an easement. But the Wetlands Reserve will do similar things. Sometimes they'll pay 100% for a permanent easement. And the Wetland Reserve Program is really interesting because it will also pay for a significant portion of restoration as well, depending on the term of that easement. So once again, these are, real conservation opportunities, real value there. When thinking about these programs and some of the challenges that practitioners talk about, the number one thing that always comes up is complexity. These are complicated programs. They require really trained professionals, primarily from NRCS, to help guide you through that process. But on the flip side, there's also capacity constraints within NRCS to really build these programs out. So your local NRCS office has a big say in what programs or what easements, what enrollment happens in your local geography. So it's really important to build those strong relationships with the NRCS office and get them as many resources as possible. And that gets back to the last kind of program that I skipped over, which is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which allows NRCS and groups of nonprofits and organizations working locally to kind of direct and target funding around a specific region. So pulling from all those other programs and helping target funding while also leveraging outside resources and match to bring additional resources to bear. So going back to this, one of the things that is really, top of mind and has been a big, challenge in the past, but is often changing now and is really growing is kind of the dialogue of or the narrative of a conservationist versus a farmer, and that they're often at odds. And we see an opportunity to continue to change that narrative, as a lot of the organizations here are already working on, and looking for those partnership opportunities where, working land, agricultural land can still be utilized while providing that conservation value and that benefit. So
Ben,
when we
one interruption. This is Peter. That I'd like to add is just a much more modest program, but has sort of really good bridging potential to take some of the mechanisms we identified, some of the things that are already going on in the region, and take them the next step, which is the Conservation Innovation Grants. We were lucky to be doing this work while the process of creating the new Farm Bill was occurring. There now is a new Farm Bill. It's been in place for 4 or 5 months. Not all the rules have been written, but we certainly know that there is both greater authorized funding capacity for the regional conservation program partnerships and very strong bill language for the conservation innovation grants, including continuing the priority theme of conservation finance. So that just gives us a leg up in the process of maybe bringing some of the ideas that we uncovered as a consulting team to the foundation sharing it with grantees, but we know that there is a more receptive and supportive NRCS under the new Farm Bill to do these things.
Great, that's a great point, Peter. And moving into some of these recommendations, hopefully you guys have had a chance to kind of skim them over. And these, I think it's important when you're looking at these recommendations to remember that this report was primarily initially designed with the foundation in mind, thinking through how someone in the foundation's position might support conservation practitioners on the ground. So we laid out, providing funds directly to agricultural organizations, whether that be folks like soil and water conservation districts and others who can collaborate with farmers on the ground to get conservation practices in the ground. We talked about directly providing some of the match and cost share that is needed for some of these programs. Supporting the development of RCPP programs because of the value that they bring. Similarly, there's a technical service provider program through NRCS where third parties can be trained and then provide assistance to farmers on the ground to enroll in NRCS programs. And we see this as an opportunity to potentially bring additional capacity. Once again, supporting local NRCS capacity in a lot of different geographies. NRCS offices have co-funded positions, whether it be with a conservation organization or another entity, where that position is an employee of another organization or a part-time employee of NRCS and providing services to NRCS and providing that resource. And then finally, this is something you'll see throughout our work in our report when you read it and get a chance to sit down with it, is talking about the foundation as a convener and educator and supporter of education within the region. So that was something that came up a ton in our interviews with our local practitioners. It's just the critical role that Donnelly Foundation plays in helping the organizations in our region be leaders in, the conservation movement and how they can continue to play that support role. So we wanted to call that out. So moving to the next strategy is to build upon the link between watershed protection and stormwater management and the growing body of work and financing mechanisms around this. So it's important to remember kind of the importance of water in our region. Obviously, Lake Michigan is here. It's where a portion of us get our drinking water. But it's also important to think about the impact that our stormwater management has on the region, as well as the way in which our waterways interact with our landscape and the natural areas around. So I think it's just important to be reminded of that and think through some of that work. So what we did in this strategy is you'll see a few different kind of sub-strategies or efforts that kind of all do a good job of linking that watershed protection with conservation and opportunities for the foundation to play a greater role in that. And the first one is really supporting the work that a number of organizations are doing already in pushing looking for opportunities to better utilize the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund. So the Clean Water Revolving Loan Funds are actually two separate funds, one kind of targeting source water protection and drinking water, the other targeting wastewater. So traditionally, these funds have been, they're loan programs, so there is a repayment, but these funds have typically targeted traditional gray infrastructure, pipes and treatment plants. And you're starting to see a movement to kind of think through what are the other investments that, whether it be water utilities or municipalities, can be making that will have similar effects in terms of protecting drinking water or treating stormwater and wastewater, and what could they be doing that also has a conservation value, whether in Chicago, a big example, or in our urban environments, green infrastructure is obviously a big component of that. In some of our outlying areas, it might be source water protection and upstream benefits if surface water is utilized. So there's a variety of different ways. A number of great examples exist out there. The primary one that comes to mind is Ohio, which has a great model for how to have a sponsored project program wherein utilities are able to, when they go in for a loan from the revolving loan fund, they're able to invest a portion of the interest or of what they would have had to return in that loan into a green infrastructure project or an environmentally beneficial project. Additionally, there's added points within the ranking system given to green projects. Each state kind of handles that a little differently. And to be honest, within the ranking system, it's not a huge bump. But it is important to think that if that 10% of green project reserve, which is what's laid out in the initial law, was fully realized, that you're looking at significant funds going towards what would be considered green projects, whether that's green infrastructure or source water protection or land conservation, traditional land conservation. So next, I want to talk about stormwater user fees as another opportunity within our region. So just a quick definition for those who might not know, but it's a fee charged to property owners within the municipal service area or the stormwater utility to finance the cost of stormwater project implementation. So typically these are pretty low fees, somewhere between $3 and $7 per month. Sometimes they're a little lower, sometimes they can be a bit higher, but we're not talking a huge fee. And we just, for optics there, kind of put, if, from that 3 to 7 million, assuming there's about 3 million households within the geography we're working in, you're talking $100 to $250 million a year. So not only is this a potential huge funding source, and a number of communities already have stormwater utility fees. However, there's a great deal of the region that are still in the works in terms of getting stormwater utilities and stormwater fees in place. And we looked at this as an easy opportunity, or maybe not easy, but a ripe opportunity for folks to leverage work that's already been done throughout the region and throughout the country on stormwater user fees, and create an additional funding revenue stream that, while many municipalities do use these funds for gray infrastructure as well, pipes and treatment facilities and things like that, it's also an opportunity to try and push for those funds to be directed towards permanent green infrastructure. So finally, the last water focused strategy that we're going to talk about is retention and water quality trading, and more broadly, kind of environmental credit trading. So there's some great work done by TNC and MPC in our region, as I'm sure many people are familiar, around Storm Store and the great work there. But there's also other opportunities too. So there's kind of two programs to think about. It's similar, you have the stormwater side of it and you have the source water protection side of it. So from the source water protection, you have water quality trading, thinking about what are the ecosystem service benefits that can be placed on a landscape to then protect our water for drinking, as well as, which then reduces treatment costs, which then creates a market opportunity. On the flip side, you have retention credit trading, and this helps with municipalities in combined sewer overflow geographies, or with MS4 consent decrees, whatever it might be, that are restricting or putting a regulatory burden on a stormwater utility or a municipality to really treat their stormwater. So it's an opportunity to invest in green infrastructure, invest in permanent conservation, using this regulatory driver as the real legs. And I definitely encourage folks to read the report, but also if you're looking to dive deeper, the DC Water Stormwater Retention Credit Program is a great example and kind of the model, but also the work that folks in our region are doing around Storm Store is another great example, and something in the works within our geography. So challenges, again, like all these programs, when you're either dealing with a state agency or a market-based program, you're going to have an administrative burden, especially around quantifying the water quality benefits, so that monitoring and verification piece. Additionally, there's complexity to a lot of these programs in terms of how are they established, how do you price, how do you ensure equity throughout, and really thinking through all the parameters within a program and how it is deployed. And luckily, there are a lot of great examples, as mentioned previously. And then development demands in our region, and how do the development demands in our region create or hinder the opportunity for conservation, especially in highly urbanized areas where land value is really high. So there might not be as much of an incentive to put, you know, a vacant parcel into conservation when there's market demand for that for commercial or residential, and there's a greater economic incentive to a property owner. So thinking through those programs and thinking through how they're designed to best incentivize is really key. So what we said to what we laid out in kind of our recommendation section was to first, you know, support that advocacy work on the state revolving loan fund that's already in the works. There's a group that's kind of gotten together and is working on that. And we pointed, you know, the foundation and others to that group of practitioners and said they're the ones who are really driving this in Illinois. There's similar work, you know, starting at a slower pace in Indiana, but, you know, each state operates differently. Then we talked about supporting initiatives for user fees. They're often referenda. They often require public campaigns to get them passed, and sometimes they need the political will, and building that is the role that practitioners can play with the support of foundations. Better aligning the stormwater and conservation goals, so looking for where there is that dual benefit and really promoting that, so doing mapping, doing prioritization work to really lay that out. Monitoring the trading programs in the works and looking for new ones as they're ripe and supporting those. And then that education and training piece again. So the third strategy that we looked at was partnering with utilities for right-of-way conversion. So when we thought about this strategy, we looked at this map, which it's a little hard to kind of get into, but the yellow is the electrical transmission corridors, and the green is our protected and managed areas, natural areas. The dark green is the additional transmission corridors that are adjacent to protected and natural areas. So the map's a little fuzzy and a little messy, but what it shows us is that our corridors, our electric utility corridors specifically, are numerous and flow throughout the region and are really an opportunity for connection and thinking about that kind of landscape scale opportunity. So when we looked at the data, we used some estimates, and what we found was about, you know, our electric power line utility corridors represented potentially between 135 and 160,000 acres just within the Chicago wilderness geography. So to put that into perspective, if we have about 500,000 acres of protected land, we're talking about a third of that in terms of utility corridors, electrical power lines. I mean, in addition, there's gas power line or gas corridors and some other utility corridors that could potentially increase that number. So you're talking about a huge opportunity and a scale that's not quite seen in a highly parcelized landscape. Additionally, when we did the math and we ran the query on this, there was about 10% of those utility corridors were adjacent to protected and managed areas. So it's an opportunity to extend that natural area, create that opportunity, and create that connection from one natural area to another, really create that system-wide landscape scale opportunity that we've been looking for. So some of the challenges around this, one, you know, the utility community has really come a long way and are doing a lot of work. NIPSCO and ComEd have both done conversions with, you know, partners in our region, and continue to kind of convert their right-of-ways from turf grass to more naturalized habitats. And one of the things around that is creating that culture of conservation and changing that mindset to understand that we might be mowing, you know, turf grass now, but in the future we're going to have prairies in those corridors, or we're going to have a different type of ecosystem, and we're going to have to manage it differently. And that doesn't mean, you know, I mean, it's just it's a different type of work, and it's a different type of mindset for practitioners who are sometimes, you know, very comfortable with the way that things have been. Additionally, there's always training, expertise, and resources that go along with that. The cost of conversion is often something we think about. So, you know, ComEd and NIPSCO, the two biggest in our region, are really kind of doing this, you know, piece by piece, thinking through where it makes the most sense, where to move forth, and we really thought about how can we leverage additional resources to help speed that process along. So our recommendations to the foundation: prioritize where the foundation's priorities around natural areas were with utility corridors, and work with local partners to push for the conversions in those geographies. So thinking through that, we suggested directly funding and supporting that conversion. So, you know, a public-private kind of partnership with the utilities to increase the dollars going directly to habitat conversion in corridors. And then funding and supporting best management practice research. So there's a group based out of UIC. Some of the folks are on this webinar currently, focused on right-of-way conversions, and really, and that's the right-of-way working group, and really thinking about how partners in that group and other groups are building a body of knowledge and a practice around this, and thinking through how to keep, you know, how to do this safely, how to do it well, how to take into account environmental concerns as well as, you know, the work concerns around line of sight and other things that the utility companies are working around. So overall, really just kind of balancing that out and supporting the work that's going on with practitioners on the ground now around that research piece. So finally, I'm going to pass it off to Peter, who's going to talk about the last strategy, and then we'll wrap up our presentation.
So if we had done this 6 or 7 years ago, we would have stopped here, but we couldn't help because for two reasons. One, there is a pretty robust carbon offset trading marketplace in the United States of America. We'll go into the drivers that created that in a second. And secondly, this strategy actually had applicability both in the greater Chicago wilderness region and in coastal South Carolina. So the carbon offsets, if we go to the next slide, basically in the compliance market, also called the regulated market, an emitter of greenhouse gases can meet part of their reduction targets, a relatively modest amount, but something that has caused in California a couple of $100 million of carbon offset transactions to occur in the last 4 years. They can meet some of their required reductions in the emission of greenhouse gases by purchasing an offset. The creator of the offset is the owner of a forest who agrees for, in the case of the compliance market, a very long period of time, 100 years, to maintain a certain amount of timber volume on that property. And if they agree to that in a carbon project development agreement, then they get registered, it gets verified, and they are then issued a certain number of offsets that can be sold to parties that are emitting greenhouse gases in California. If this was the only thing going on, we still would have included this. But beyond California, there's very significant progress being made in the legislative sessions that are just coming to an end right now in California and Oregon, so maybe it'll take another year. But the policy folks engaged in this have given us a pretty positive sense that both Oregon and Washington will join or create something very similar to the California market. The province of Quebec has already joined the California market, and now there's renewed effort in the 8 states that are part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative to create a compliance market around forest carbon offsets as well. So that's the regulated market. In addition to the regulated market, there's a voluntary market. And in the past, the voluntary market was sort of corporate social responsibility. Apple decides to neutralize the carbon footprint or carbon impact of the packaging for the next iteration of an iPhone, and they'll buy carbon credits, or buy a forest that generates carbon credits. There's quite a bit of progress being made in the voluntary market right now in anticipation of 2021, when international airlines will be using the standards in the voluntary market to offset the greenhouse gas emissions from their industry. And the reason I bring that up is the fragmented nature of property ownership in the greater Chicago area lends itself by and large to the voluntary market, with one big exception. And let's go to the next slide. Between resource conservation districts and county forest preserves, there's a significant amount of land. This is just a list of county forest preserves in the greater Chicago region, where we used, I think, a conservative estimate that 25% of the land owned outright in, let's use the very first one in the case of Cook County, 25% of the almost 70,000 acres that they own is forested. If they were to pursue, maybe in partnership with one of the Donnelly grantees or a couple of the Donnelly grantees, registration and verification into the California regulated program, and again, I believe this is conservative, our estimate of the first year payment, what would happen when those carbon credits were sold to a greenhouse gas emitter in California, is it would generate $2.33 million, which for budget constrained units of public land management like forest reserves or conservation districts, that would be a significant amount of dollars without changing the use pattern of that land to any great extent. And then to the extent that they continue in the program, it's almost like a modest annuity. Each year an additional, in the case of Cook County, an additional $86,000 at least would be generated through the annual growth of that forest, which would be an annual increment of additional offsets. So we got pretty excited about this. In fact, I got very excited about this, and both David and Ben and others had to calm me down. But we really wanted to share this with you. We are, one of the phase 3 activities is thinking through how this might be implemented with a public agency partner or multiple public agency partners. And that's something we'll talk about at the very end. But carbon credits are real right now. The actual regulated market gets compressed, meaning more of the credits have to come from California, not to pick on Illinois, but basically the other 48 states are going to have a reduced amount of carbon credits that they can sell into the California marketplace. But the good news is the voluntary market is getting stronger, and the airlines' participation in the voluntary market lends itself both to some of the public land ownerships in this region, which are modest in scale, and it definitely lends itself to private forest ownership by family forest owners in this region. I'm going to stop there.
Peter, do you want to talk about the recommendations around this strategy?
Well, we're getting a little short on time. So what I touched on the fact that by chance, the 3 partners in this consulting team have direct practical experience in doing their own carbon deals. So we think we can help evaluate carbon project developers if the direction is to partner with them. We've recommended to the foundation that some of the additional feasibility research should be supported by the foundation, that there may be a reason for grant money. So Donnelly Foundation and maybe other philanthropic resources in the region might want to undertake some of the soft cost expenditures associated with this. just to speed the implementation of this activity. We'd also like to see the results, the financial results or outcomes associated with carbon offset transactions find their way into further restoration and conservation related activities by the public agency partners that own the land. Now I'll stop. So where we are, I mentioned we're in phase 3, which is a relatively modest continuation of work by the 3 partner consulting organizations directly with the staff of the foundation, sharing the work we've done to date as exemplified by this webinar, looking through some of the steps in the implementation pathway for some of these recommendations, and to the extent the foundation elects to have us support some of these activities, that'll be a determination by the foundation going forward. And an example of collecting further feedback, we can now go to Q&A.
Yeah, so thank you, Peter. At this point, we want to kind of open it up again for questions. So please, if you have additional questions, please remember to click on the Q&A box and type those in. Additionally, we saw a few other questions or another question come in through the chat window, and that's all right as well. So Peter, I'm going to throw it back to you. We have a question from Chris Kieran here that asked, are there additional requirements that would disqualify public agencies because they're already planning to keep the land forested anyway?
Well, it's a good question. Well, I have to be polite to Chris for asking a good question, but unless there is a legislated mandate, possibly through the funding source, an example would be if stateside land and water conservation fund money was used, there's a covenant that goes along with that funding source that would require the land to stay conserved, or if it was converted to another use, further conservation done to replace that. But by and large, most of the lands owned by public agencies don't have those additional restrictions. So there would be a need to dig pretty deeply on a property by property basis to make sure this truly was additional. And for better or for worse, there are examples within the region and outside the region of public agencies alienating, selling their property for other land uses, and this would obviously resolve that issue.
Thank you. We had a question about the NRCS funding data for each state and how we got that. So each state produces an annual report laying out, NRCS does an annual report laying out each state in detail, kind of what went to each program from that state. At which point we kind of summed up all the programs, worked from there, and we're able to get those grand totals. So that's available through NRCS. And if anyone has any questions about how to find that, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'm happy to point you in that direction.
Well, we stay on that one for one more second. We did not do this, but because of a sense we have from other parts of the United States, and we have followed a foundation who supported this kind of analysis in New England, we do think the greater Chicago wilderness region, a tiny bit of Michigan, and more significant parts of the other 3 states, is kind of underrepresented dollar-wise compared to the rest of the country, even though one of the states is an I state, which usually gets a lot of NRCS money. And I think it might be worth a conversation going forward about whether or not that kind of analysis should be done for a lot of reasons. One reason being to share with congressional members from the 4 states.
Great. So Sarah Coulter had a question, Peter, to you again around can you explain the last column of the carbon credit slide, the $5 per acre?
Yeah, so the way both in the voluntary market and the compliance market, a carbon offset works is if you think of the forest, we'll use the compliance or regulated market, the forest has timber stocking or timber volume greater than the regional average. And the difference between the regional average and the amount of that particular, what that particular forest has as far as forest volume is captured in that first year initial offset. But the good thing about forests is they continue to grow. An average growth rate in this part of the country might be somewhere between 2.5% and 3.5% per year. So that percent was applied to that first year offset sale, and that's how we got the $5 an acre approximately.
So we had a question around what is the potential for gas line or gas pipeline right-of-way corridors to be converted? And unfortunately, we did not look into that as part of this research, but that is definitely something that we are thinking about within, further research and follow-up, is to get a clearer picture of the other utility right-of-ways that could potentially add to that number. So we had a question from Emmy Browley regarding the Illinois State Revolving Loan Fund. Is access to low-cost loan capital a barrier to land conversion in Chicago? Several NGOs have internal revolving funds. Their foundation PRIs, and the Conservation Fund has the Conservation Loan Program. Just curious if research showed how if there's gaps in interim funding. So our research didn't go into that level of detail. What we did do was look to practitioners to kind of point us to where they saw opportunity and they saw potential for growth. And a lot of the practitioners we were engaging with as part of this research emphasized a lack of loan funding or short-term bridge funding and the opportunity within the State Revolving Loan Fund as kind of one potential source. The other thing around the State Revolving Loan Fund that people are really excited is about the opportunity for sponsored projects and the way in which those can essentially form a funding source that does not need to be returned. So the way the Ohio program is the utility takes out the loan for traditional gray infrastructure, and then a portion of what they would have had to return to the loan goes to a sponsored project. It's a small percentage. It's usually the interest, but that allows for conservation on the ground to happen in a non-repaid kind of manner. So outside of a traditional loan. So it's an interesting policy lever that can provide some additional funding as well.
We also, going beyond Ohio, there's a lot of work by a lot of innovative folks within the agencies that manage and run the SRFs and a lot of policy NGOs that are focused on this. And, there are now 8 states that have the equivalent of a sponsorship program, and they're all a little different, and they all iterate from actually Iowa and Ohio. But if you begin to dig into that, and the Water Resource Finance Center at EPA is a great place to find out more information about that.
So we had a question. So as a policy action, government land management agencies currently cannot participate in CRP or WRP programs, so the Conservation Reserve Program or the Wetland Reserve Program. It would be great to lobby NRCS to allow ag lands held by public agencies to be eligible. That was a question or a statement from Jim Anderson. I will leave that to all people to think about. And if there's folks who want to champion that, I'm sure you'll find a lot of fellow passionate folks that are part of this webinar. There was a question just logistically, will there be a recording available? There will be. It's going to be available on the Donnelly website. So another question was, what about urban forests managed by municipalities for the carbon market, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, again, notwithstanding how bullish we are about the carbon market, it's complicated. There's a lot of transactional fiction, so you have to be working at a certain scale. An example would be in the compliance market, the amount of time that the staff of whoever owns the property would be dedicating to this, the ability to engage with a carbon project developer who's only going to work at a certain scale, and the net financial results have to support the ongoing verification that's required under a carbon agreement. So in the California compliance market, it's hard to get comfortable suggesting anything less than somewhere between 3,500 and 5,000 acres would be the minimum parcel size or the minimum acreage. It doesn't have to be a single parcel, it just has to be a single ownership. There is a movement to do aggregation in the compliance market that doesn't exist quite yet. There is a few examples now of aggregation in the voluntary market, but again, it has to aggregate up to a certain scale. And if a city agency's forest resources, added up together could get to that scale, then there's no reason that a municipality couldn't participate.
Great. So the next question is also around carbon credits. So keep you on the spot, Peter. Are there different credit costs for creating woodlands from previously disturbed lands, i.e. ag lands, by planting trees through restoration practices as opposed to existing natural areas?
Yeah, a good question. There are afforestation credits. They are not nearly as valuable per acre because you're planting trees that are very young and they don't sequester all that much carbon until they get a little bit older. But both the California market and the voluntary market have protocols for afforestation, essentially putting forests back to places that don't have forests currently. There's some policy implications associated with that. Should all farmland be converted to forests again? I won't even begin to delve into that, but there certainly are credits for afforestation and reforestation, but those credits are significantly less valuable per acre.
So we have two questions related to utility corridor as an opportunity. One around there's efforts already underway to convert utility corridors. Do we have a sense of the percentage of these spaces that are still yet to be managed in this way? We did not look into that as part of this research. There is still a significant percentage. I would point you towards the right-of-way working group housed at UIC, as well as with a number of other partners for more details on the nuts and bolts data, as well as the utilities can provide some of that information as well. And then to follow up, there used to be considerable resistance to prescribed fire in proximity to electric utility corridors. Is this still the case? Can it be made safer? There's obviously concerns around management and how to do that work. The field has come a considerable way, and that's once again, I'd point you towards the right-of-way working group for some of their best management practices, and then the work they're doing around conservation in those areas. I can't speak directly to prescribed burning and how folks are approaching that, but there are some practitioners out there who we can reach out to and get a little more depth on that for you. So I see one more question. What would be needed for prairie restorations, for example, restoring former ag land, to also be eligible for carbon offsets given their large amount of underground biomass? So Peter, do you want to talk a little bit about soil carbon?
Yeah, I mean, there's an example would be a number of the conservation innovation grants that have been made by NRCS to a variety of groups around the country are focused on this. The Voluntary Market has a soil carbon protocol. Climate Trust, based in Oregon, has some experience in this regard. I would look to them for their experience. Right now, the compliance market doesn't recognize soil carbon with one narrow exception about, if there is existing grassland and you can prove that there is a high probability of it being converted to either development or more intensive agriculture, there's an avoided grassland conversion offset recognized in the California market. So it's evolving, it's worth paying attention to. There possibly are some workarounds by using conservation easement mechanisms as opposed to carbon markets. But I think going to the Climate Trust and going to the NRCS website and looking at some of the current conservation innovation grants, including one where the Delta Institute is a partner, would be worth taking a look at.
Great. And there was one final question just around the NRCS data at the watershed or county level. I'll have to look into that and get back to you. I don't believe you can get it as a finance piece at that level, but I will double check and put that within the FAQ that we produced from these questions. And if there's additional questions that folks have within the next day or two, please feel free to shoot me an email and we will add those to the FAQ. As we said, the recording will be available to all those who registered, but also on the Donnelly website. And with that, I mean, before I pass it back to David to kind of close, I think it's important to recognize, Donnelly Foundation for really championing this work and pushing forth to think through how they can better support, the conservation community as a whole in our geography and in South Carolina, and really enhance the work that we're doing. So I know our whole project team's really thankful to them for, all the efforts that they have done in terms of supporting this work. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to David to close.
Okay, well, I'm going to start by giving the thanks back to Ben and Peter and the team. Obviously, there's a lot here to digest. The questions I thought were fantastic, and I think really illustrate the fact that this is a work in progress. And if nothing else, our hope was to stimulate further really good conversation about what the opportunities are in the region, how we can support you, and where we all go from here. So it's been referred to as phase 3. I think phase 3 takes us off pretty far into the sunset in terms of this being an iterative process. Obviously, for all of you and for us, it's going to unfold over time. There, more discussion with our board about our future grant-making directions, but this is all going to be informed by further conversation, discussion, feedback, Q&A. So thank you so much for taking the time to participate and especially share your thoughts, and please keep it coming.
Thank you all. So please look for the recording in the next few days, and we'll follow up with any additional information. Thanks everyone for attending.